I'm here with a court order to seize this vehicle as evidence. He gestured toward the gleaming truck. This Ford contains evidence of war crimes and has been used to conceal crucial testimony. Emma's tears fell freely now as the realization hit her. The months of restoration work, the secrets they'd uncovered, the danger they'd faced, it had all led to this moment of reckoning. But how had it all begun? The journey that brought them here started 3 months earlier, on a crisp autumn morning when Emma Barrett was simply a mechanic looking for steady work. And Thomas Reynolds was just another stubborn, old veteran with a broken-down truck and a heart full of secrets. Emma Barrett wiped a streak of oil from her forehead, inadvertently leaving another in its place. The small garage where she worked buzzed with the sound of pneumatic tools and classic rock from a radio that had seen better days, much like everything else at Hayden's repair shop. At 28, Emma had the skilled hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime taking engines apart and putting them back together. Her grandfather Harold had taught her that machines spoke their own language, and if you listened closely enough, they'd tell you exactly what was wrong. "Emma, phone," Joe Hayden, the 65-year-old owner, called from the office. His voice carried the gravel of 40 years of cigarettes and engine exhaust. Emma slid out from under the '87 Chevy she'd been coaxing back to life. Joe's retirement loomed on the horizon, and with it, the likely sale of the only steady job she'd managed to hold in Pinewood, Kentucky. The thought sat in her stomach like a cold lead weight. The garage had been her sanctuary since moving to Pinewood 3 years ago, seeking a fresh start after her grandfather's death. Harold Barrett had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was just 7. He taught her not just how to fix engines, but how to navigate life's rough roads. When cancer took him, Emma had drifted, moving from one repair shop to another, unable to find the same sense of purpose she'd felt working alongside her grandfather in his small garage behind their house in Virginia. Joe Hayden had given her a chance when other shop owners had taken one look at her, female, young, no formal certifications, and shown her the door. Joe cared more about what your hands could do than what your resume said, but soon he'd be gone too, selling the shop to fund his retirement in Florida. The new owners would likely bring in their own mechanics, leaving Emma once again adrift. The phone receiver was warm and slightly greasy when she picked it up. "Hayden's Repair," Emma speaking. The voice on the other end belonged to Grace Wilson, head of the local Veterans Committee. She spoke with the gentle authority of someone used to organizing community events and wrangling stubborn ex-military men. "Emma, I have a special job that might interest you. Thomas Reynolds, he's a Vietnam vet living out on Old Mill Road, has his father's truck, a 1955 Ford F-100. It's been sitting in his barn for nearly 20 years, but now he wants it restored." Emma's heart quickened. Classic trucks were her specialty, a passion inherited from her grandfather. Still, something in Grace's tone suggested there was more to this story. "What's the catch, Mrs. Wilson?" A pause stretched over the line. "Thomas is difficult. Lost his son Daniel in Iraq about 20 years back. The truck was supposed to be their project together. Thomas can be prickly, but that truck means everything to him. You're the only one around these parts who could do it justice." Machines were straightforward, people were complicated, but the prospect of working on a classic F-100 was too tempting to pass up. Besides, with Joe retiring soon, she needed all the work she could get. "I'll check it out," Emma agreed, already mentally cataloging what a restoration of that magnitude would require. As she hung up, Joe appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag that had long ago surrendered its original color to engine grease. "Reynolds, huh?" His eyebrows rose toward his receding hairline. "That old coot hasn't let anyone touch that truck since his boy died. Must be getting soft in his old age." "You know him?" Emma asked, surprised. Joe snorted. "Everybody knows Thomas Reynolds. Decorated Vietnam vet. Used to be the town's go-to handyman before his son died. After that, he pretty much disappeared into that farm of his." Joe paused, his expression softening. "That truck was a beauty, though. His daddy bought it new, kept it immaculate. Thomas did too, until—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Good luck with that one, Emma. You'll need it." Emma spent her lunch break researching the 1955 Ford F-100, refreshing her knowledge of its specifications and common restoration challenges. The truck had a robust, straight-six engine, manual transmission, in a simplicity that modern vehicles lacked. No computers, no complex electronics, just solid American engineering designed to last decades with proper maintenance. She also looked up Thomas Reynolds, finding little beyond his name in a few local newspaper articles about veterans' events from years past. His son Daniel appeared in a high school sports article and later in a brief mention of local soldiers deployed to Iraq, but nothing else. It was as though the Reynolds family had deliberately maintained a low profile, or someone had scrubbed their digital footprint. When her shift ended, Emma packed her basic toolkit into her Toyota. If she took on this job, she'd need it for the initial assessment. The autumn afternoon had cooled considerably, but the Toyota's heater had died last winter. Another repair she kept postponing for lack of time and money. She drove with the windows up, her work jacket zipped to her chin, watching the small town of Pinewood recede in her rearview mirror. Pinewood, Kentucky sat in the shadow of the Appalachian foothills, a town that had once thrived on tobacco farming and small manufacturing, but now survived primarily on tourism and nostalgia. Main Street featured brick buildings from the 1920s, recently repainted to attract visitors looking for authentic small-town America. The tourism board had branded Pinewood as "where time slows down," which locals joked was the politest way of saying nothing had changed here in 50 years. As Emma drove her battered Toyota pickup along the winding country road that led toward the Reynolds farm, autumn painted the Kentucky hills in shades of fire. Maple trees arched overhead, their leaves creating a tunnel of red and gold that filtered the late afternoon sunlight. Fields that had once grown a tobacco now lay fallow or repurposed for hay, a testament to changing times. The GPS on her phone lost signal twice before finally announcing she had reached her destination. The Reynolds property appeared around a bend, a weathered white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a large red barn whose paint had faded to the color of dried blood. The place had good bones but showed signs of neglect. Flower beds that had once been carefully tended now sprouted weeds alongside resilient perennials that refused to surrender to abandonment. Emma parked and stepped out, her work boots crunching on gravel. The farm had the heavy silence of a place where someone lived alone for too long. No dogs barked at her arrival, no friendly waves from neighbors, just stillness, broken only by the rustle of wind through the trees. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of fallen leaves, distant wood smoke, and the earthy richness of soil preparing for winter. There was something both melancholy and peaceful about this place, a feeling of time suspended, of life paused but not quite extinguished. The screen door creaked open before she reached the porch steps. A tall man emerged slowly, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. Despite stooped shoulders and the slight tremor in his hand, Thomas Reynolds carried himself with the squared posture that military life ingrained. His hair was steel gray, face lined with the kind of stubbornness that Kentucky Hill Country specialized in producing. He wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt buttoned to the collar despite the mild day. "You the mechanic?" His voice was gravel and rust, suspicious and unwelcoming. Emma stood her ground. "Yes, sir, Emma Barrett. Grace Wilson asked me to come by about your Ford." Thomas studied her with narrowed eyes, taking in her oil-stained jeans, work boots, and the calloused hands that marked her as someone familiar with hard work. His gaze lingered on her face, as though searching for something. Trustworthiness, perhaps, or weakness. "Thought they'd send a man." The words weren't exactly hostile, just matter of fact. Some might have taken offense, but Emma had heard it all before. In the world of engines and restorations, being a woman meant constantly proving yourself. She'd learned to let her work speak for her. "My grandfather taught me everything about engines before I could drive. I specialize in classics. I've rebuilt 12 engines from the ground up this year alone." She met his gaze steadily. "But if you'd prefer someone else, I understand." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. Not quite approval, but reassessment. He nodded once sharply, then turned toward the barn without another word. Emma followed, recognizing the gesture for the grudging acceptance it was. The barn doors groaned as Thomas pulled them open, revealing a cavernous space where dust motes danced in shafts of light that broke through gaps in the wooden walls. The air inside smelled of hay, old motor oil, and the particular mustiness that comes from a space long sealed against the outside world. Farm equipment from another era rested in silent retirement along one wall. A harrow, an old plow, tools whose purposes had been rendered obsolete by time and technology. In the center, beneath a faded canvas tarp, sat a vehicle-shaped silhouette. Thomas moved toward it with reverence, his cane tapping a slow rhythm on the packed earth floor. He gripped the edge of the tarp, then hesitated, as though bracing himself for what lay beneath. "This was my daddy's," he said quietly. "He bought it new in '55, worked this farm with it, hauled tobacco, fence posts, took us to church every Sunday." His knuckles whitened on the cane. "Gave it to me before I shipped out to Vietnam. Said it would carry me home." With a swift motion that belied his age, Thomas pulled the tarp away. The 1955 Ford F-100 emerged from its shroud like a time capsule. Its once vibrant blue paint had dulled to the color of a forgotten summer sky. Rust crept along the wheel wells and rocker panels like a slow disease. The chrome grille, though tarnished, still held the proud lines of mid-century American craftsmanship. The truck sat slightly lopsided on four flat tires. Its suspension settled unevenly after decades of immobility. The windshield was intact, but clouded with years of dust. Through it, Emma could make out the bench seat upholstered in cracked leather, a simple dash with analog gauges, and a steering wheel whose original white had yellowed to the color of old ivory. Emma approached slowly, her expert eye cataloging everything. The cracked leather seats, the spider-webbed windshield, the flat tires that had surrendered to gravity long ago. This wasn't just a repair job. This was a resurrection. She opened the driver's door, wincing at the protest of rusted hinges. The interior smelled of old leather, dust, and faintly of tobacco. Not cigarettes, but the sweet, earthy scent of pipe tobacco that had seeped into the upholstery decades ago. The keys still hung from the ignition, a faded leather tag attached. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the hood. Thomas nodded, moving to the front of the truck with her. Together they lifted the heavy steel hood, propping it carefully with the original support rod. The straight-six engine was intact, but seized from decades of disuse. Mice had made homes in the air filter housing. Belts had cracked and hoses had hardened into uselessness. Yet beneath the grime and neglect, Emma saw good bones. "Can you fix it?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying an edge of vulnerability he seemed uncomfortable revealing. Emma ran her fingers along the engine block, listening to what the machine had to tell her. Every vehicle had its own story, its own particular ailments. This one spoke of abandonment, yes, but also of solid engineering that had simply been waiting for someone to care again. "Yes," she said with certainty, "it'll take time, and it won't be cheap." But as she leaned in closer to inspect the carburetor, something caught her eye. The fuel line hadn't just deteriorated with age, it had been deliberately cut, and the brake lines showed similar signs of tampering. This wasn't just neglect. Someone had intentionally disabled this truck. Emma glanced at Thomas, who was staring at the vehicle with an expression she couldn't quite read. Without drawing attention to her discovery, she continued her inspection, carefully checking beneath the seats. Her hand brushed against something, metal wedged deep under the driver's seat. A military dog tag, rusted and tarnished, the name and details illegible without proper cleaning. Thomas stiffened when she held it up. "That's not mine," he said quickly, "and it's not Daniel's." Before Emma could ask whose it might be, Thomas took it from her hand and pocketed it with a finality that discouraged questions. "The truck belonged to my father," he continued, clearly changing the subject. "Yishamo. Then to me. Was supposed to go to my boy after—" His voice faltered. "I kept it all these years. Couldn't bring myself to touch it. Now I'm thinking maybe it's time." Emma nodded, sensing there was much more to this story than a simple restoration project. Every vehicle carried memories, but this one seemed to carry secrets as well. "I'll need to make a list of parts," she said, respecting his need to keep some things private. "Some we can salvage, others we'll need to find. The engine might be salvageable if it's not seized too badly." She continued her assessment, noting the condition of each major component. The body had superficial rust, but appeared structurally sound, a testament to the quality of American steel from that era. The transmission would need to be disassembled and inspected. The electrical system would require complete rewiring. The brakes, steering, and suspension would all need rebuilding. As they discussed the practicalities of the restoration, The barn door creaked open behind them. A man about Thomas's age stepped inside, his weathered face breaking into a smile that didn't quite reach his wary eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," the newcomer said. "You actually did it, Thomas. You found someone to wake up this old beast." Thomas's posture changed subtly, straightening as though in the presence of an old commander. "Frank," he acknowledged with a nod, "this is Emma Barrett. She's going to see what she can do." Frank Mason moved with the measured gait of someone who'd seen too much combat and carried too many memories. He had the lean, rangy build of a man who had once been powerful and hadn't completely surrendered to age. His clothes, worn jeans, flannel shirt, canvas jacket, were practical and unfussy. He offered Emma a hand calloused from years of labor. "Frank Mason, served with Thomas in the 173rd Airborne, back when we were both young enough to believe we were invincible." Emma shook his hand, noting the strength still present in his grip. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Mason." Frank circled the truck, whistling low. "Last time I saw this old girl, she was running like a dream. Thomas used to take such pride in her." He ran a hand along the fender. "Then after Daniel," he stopped abruptly, glancing at Thomas, whose jaw had tightened. "Daniel always loved this truck," Frank continued more carefully. "Said it connected him to his grandfather, to his roots. He had plans for it, didn't he, Thomas?" Thomas gave a curt nod but remained silent, his eyes fixed on the Ford as though it might suddenly speak and reveal all its secrets. Frank turned to Emma. "You know, I might have some of the original service manuals for this model. My brother collected them, and I've got some specialized tools that might help with the restoration. I'll bring them by next time I come." As Frank spoke, his eyes kept drifting to Thomas, watching him with the careful attention of someone monitoring a bomb that might detonate. There was history between these men, complicated, deep, and not entirely resolved. "Daniel was a good kid," Frank said, addressing Emma, but clearly speaking for Thomas's benefit. "Smart, observant. He noticed things others missed. That's what made him so good in Iraq. He was in intelligence, you know, before—" His voice trailed off. Thomas's knuckles whitened on his cane. "That's enough, Frank." Frank nodded, respecting the boundary. "Sorry, old friend, just remembering." He turned to Emma. "Daniel discovered something over there, something important, related to his unit and a private military contractor. He was trying to gather evidence when—" Frank stopped as Thomas shot him a warning glance. Emma pretended to focus on the truck's engine, giving the two men the illusion of privacy while she absorbed every word. Whatever had happened to Daniel Reynolds, it clearly wasn't as simple as the official story suggested. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather-bound book. "Found this in my attic. It's the original service manual for this model. Thought it might help." He handed it to Emma. "And I've got some special tools for working on these old carburetors. They don't make them like this anymore." Emma accepted the manual gratefully. "This will be incredibly helpful, thank you." As she flipped through the yellowed pages, Frank moved closer to Thomas. "You're doing the right thing," and he said quietly. "It's time to let this truck tell its story." Thomas's expression remained unreadable, but he gave a small nod. The manual was comprehensive, covering every aspect of the F-100's mechanics with detailed illustrations and specifications. As Emma studied it, Frank shared stories from Vietnam, how he and Thomas had kept their unit's vehicles running with nothing but basic tools and ingenuity. "Once deep in the jungle, our transport broke down," Frank recalled. "Middle of hostile territory, monsoon season. Thomas here fashioned a new fan belt out of parachute cord and some rubber from a poncho. Kept that engine cool enough to get us back to base." Thomas snorted. "Would have been easier if you hadn't gotten us lost in the first place." Frank laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to momentarily lift years from both men's faces. "Navigation was never my strong suit." For a brief moment, Emma glimpsed what these two men must have been like decades ago. Young, resourceful, bound by the particular brotherhood that forms under fire. Then Thomas winced as he shifted his weight, his hand automatically moving to rub his right knee, and the spell was broken. Frank showed Emma a few tricks for freeing the seized engine components, his knowledge impressive for someone who wasn't a professional mechanic. "Learned out of necessity in Vietnam," he explained. "When your transport breaks down in hostile territory, you either fix it or die trying." Emma took mental notes, recognizing that Frank's techniques, though unconventional, were born of practical experience. He demonstrated how to create a penetrating oil mixture that was more effective than commercial products, using ingredients that could be found in any kitchen. The secret is patience, he explained, carefully applying the mixture to frozen bolts. Let it work its way in. Force is the enemy of these old machines. The three worked together for nearly an hour, with Frank demonstrating techniques and Thomas occasionally offering information about the truck's history. The tension between the two veterans gradually eased as they focused on the mechanical tasks at hand. Thomas recalled how his father had taught him to change the oil in this very truck when he was just 12 years old, standing on a wooden crate to reach the engine. Frank shared stories of the road trips he and Thomas had taken after returning from Vietnam, when they were both trying to readjust to civilian life. This truck got us all the way to the Grand Canyon and back, Frank remembered. Summer of '70, no air conditioning, AM radio that picked up nothing but static in the mountains, and a cooler full of beer in the back. And that waitress in Arizona, Thomas added unexpectedly, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. What was her name? The one with the turquoise earrings? Darlene, Frank supplied immediately. She liked you, but you were too shy to ask for her number. Thomas shook his head. Wasn't shy. Just smart enough to know a desert flower wouldn't transplant well to Kentucky soil. These fragments of their shared past revealed a different Thomas than the bitter, isolated man Emma had first met. Someone who had once laughed, traveled, noticed pretty waitresses with turquoise earrings. Someone who had lived before grief had calcified around him like the rust on his father's truck. When they finally emerged from the barn, the afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the horizon. Frank and Emma were discussing the best sources for authentic parts when a sleek black SUV pulled into the driveway, tires crunching aggressively on the gravel. Thomas froze, his entire demeanor shifting from grudging collaboration to alert wariness. Frank, too, straightened, his hand instinctively moving to his hip as though reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. A man in his early 40s stepped out of the SUV. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that seemed out of place in rural Kentucky, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. His resemblance to Thomas was subtle but unmistakable. Something in the set of his jaw and the shape of his eyes marked him as family. "Uncle Thomas," the man called, his voice carrying a practiced smoothness that suggested courtrooms and corporate boardrooms. "I see you have visitors today. How unusual." Thomas's face hardened. "Calvin," he acknowledged without warmth, "what brings you here? More papers for me to sign?" Calvin Reynolds approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way. His smile remained fixed as his gaze swept over Frank and lingered on Emma, assessing and dismissing her in the same moment. Up close, Emma could see the expensive watch on his wrist, the subtle monogram on his shirt cuff, the overall polish of someone whose daily routine included more grooming products than Emma used in a month. "Just checking on my favorite uncle, making sure you're taking care of yourself." Calvin's words sounded caring, but his tone carried an undercurrent of condescension. "I see you finally decided to do something with Dad's old truck." "Your grandfather's truck," Thomas corrected sharply. "And yes, Miss Barrett here is going to restore it." Calvin raised an eyebrow. "Restore it? That seems like a waste of money at your age, Uncle. Wouldn't it be simpler to sell the property and move somewhere more manageable? The offer from the development company still stands. They'd take care of everything, the house, the land, even that old truck." The tension between them crackled like static electricity before a storm. This was clearly an old argument, worn smooth by repetition, but no less heated for it. "This is my home," Thomas said flatly. "I'm not selling to some corporation that wants to turn farmland into vacation homes for people who wouldn't know which end of a cow gives milk." Calvin sighed dramatically. "Always so stubborn, just like Daniel." His eyes narrowed. "Speaking of my dear departed cousin, did you know his old unit is being investigated? Seems there were some irregularities with a private contractor they worked with. Atlas Security Solutions." Thomas went rigid. Frank stepped forward slightly, as though placing himself between the two men. "Daniel was looking into those irregularities before he died," Calvin continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He wasn't suicidal, Uncle Thomas. He was scared. Someone threatened him, and instead of coming to me, a lawyer who could have helped, he tried to gather evidence. Emma watched Thomas's face pale beneath its weathered tan. That's enough, Calvin, Frank interjected. Calvin turned his attention to Frank, his smile tightening. Mr. Mason, still hanging around, I see. Tell me, how's retirement treating you? Found any productive hobbies? Frank didn't respond, but Emma noticed his jaw clench. Calvin returned his focus to Thomas. Uncle, I'm only trying to help. This farm is too much for you. The taxes alone are eating away what little savings you have. And now you're spending money on restoring that truck? Be reasonable. My money's my business, Thomas growled. Now state your purpose or leave. Calvin straightened his already impeccable tie. Fine. I came to tell you that there's been an inquiry opened into Daniel's death. New evidence suggests it wasn't suicide, which means someone killed him. His eyes locked with Thomas's. Someone who might have had a reason to silence him. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Get off my property, Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. Calvin held up his hands in mock surrender. Of course, I've said what I came to say. He turned to leave but paused when he noticed Emma watching the exchange. Miss Barrett, was it? A word of advice. Be careful what projects you take on. Some restorations uncover things that were meant to stay buried. With that parting shot, Calvin returned to his SUV and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in his wake. The three stood in silence until the sound of the engine faded. Thomas's breathing was labored, his face ashen. You okay? Frank asked quietly. Thomas nodded once, sharply. Just need to sit down a minute. He moved stiffly toward the porch, leaving Emma and Frank alone. What was that about? Emma asked in a hushed voice. Frank sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. Family drama. Calvin's father, Thomas's brother, died a few years back. Left Calvin the family law practice and a lot of ambition. He's been trying to get Thomas to sell this place for years. But Emma sensed there was more to it than simple real estate. And Daniel, Thomas's son? Frank's eyes grew distant. Official story is he committed suicide after returning from his second tour in Iraq. PTSD. It happens. He shook his head. But Daniel wasn't the type. He was investigating something about the private contractor his unit worked with. Said he had evidence of wrongdoing. Frank's voice dropped even lower. A week before he died, he told me he'd hidden something important. Something that would blow it all wide open. Then they found him with a bullet in his head and ruled it suicide. Emma glanced toward the barn where the Ford F-100 sat, its secrets waiting to be uncovered. And the truck? How does that fit in? That's the thing, Frank said. I don't know, but the day before he died, Daniel came to see it. Spent hours alone in that barn. Thomas doesn't know that. He was at the VA hospital that day. And I never told him because you didn't want to give him false hope, Emma finished. Frank nodded. That truck is all Thomas has left of both his father and his son. Whatever you find while restoring it, be gentle with how you reveal it. The implications of what Frank was saying settled over Emma like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about restoring a classic truck anymore. It was about potentially uncovering evidence in what might be a murder investigation. Evidence that powerful people might want to remain hidden. Does Calvin know about Daniel visiting the truck before he died, she asked. Frank's expression darkened. Calvin knows a lot of things he shouldn't. He's got connections, government, military contractors. That law firm of his represents some powerful clients, including Atlas Security. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Should I be worried? Frank studied her face for a long moment. Just be careful, and if you find anything, come to me first. Not Thomas, not right away. He's been through enough. After Frank left, Emma found Thomas sitting on the porch, staring out at the fields as the light began to fade. The land rolled away from the farmhouse in gentle waves, the crops long harvested, leaving only stubble that glowed golden in the late afternoon sun. In the distance, the Appalachian foothills rose in a blue-gray haze, ancient and unchanging. I should be going, she said. I'll make a list of what we need and come back tomorrow to get started, if that works for you. Thomas looked up, his eyes focusing on her as though returning from a distant place. Why did you agree to this job? Grace must have told you I'm not easy to work with. Emma considered her answer carefully. My grandfather always said machines have souls. They carry the imprints of the people who love them. This truck has been waiting a long time to run again. I'd like to help it. Something in Thomas's expression softened fractionally. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He was, Emma said simply. He taught me everything I know about engines and about life. Thomas nodded, seeming to come to a decision. Be here at 8 tomorrow. We'll get started. As Emma drove home through the gathering dusk, her mind raced with questions. What had Daniel discovered in Iraq? What was Calvin's real agenda? And most importantly, what secrets might be hidden within the aging body of that Ford F-100? The road wound through forests where the trees were shedding their autumn finery, leaves spiraling down to carpet the asphalt in crimson and gold. Emma drove slowly, partly because of the poor condition of her Toyota's brakes, but mostly because she needed time to process everything she had learned today. Daniel Reynolds had found something, evidence of wrongdoing by a private military contractor. He had hidden that evidence, possibly in his father's truck. Then he had died under suspicious circumstances. Now his cousin Calvin, who worked for the very company Daniel had been investigating, was pressuring Thomas to sell the farm and the truck. It was no coincidence that after 20 years of neglect, Thomas had suddenly decided to restore the F-100. Something had changed, some new information had come to light. Grace Wilson might know more, but Emma hesitated to involve her directly. The fewer people who knew what she was looking for, the safer everyone would be. That night, Emma sat at her small kitchen table, researching the Ford F-100 restoration process on her laptop. But her searches soon drifted to Daniel Reynolds Iraq, Atlas Security Solutions, and military contractor Misconduct Iraq. The results painted a disturbing picture. Atlas Security Solutions had been implicated in several controversies: unauthorized use of force, misappropriation of military supplies, even allegations of arms trafficking. Each time, investigations mysteriously ended without conclusions. Several whistleblowers had died under questionable circumstances, officially ruled as accidents or suicides. Emma found an article about Daniel Reynolds, a brief mention in a local paper about his death. The report was sterile and minimal. Daniel Reynolds, 27, Army Intelligence, died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Survived by his father, Thomas Reynolds. No services by request. Something about the terse announcement felt wrong, as though the real story had been deliberately obscured. Emma dug deeper, searching for information about Daniel's unit. Several members had died in the years following their deployment. Car accidents, drug overdoses, suicides. The statistical improbability was striking. She searched for information on Calvin Reynolds, finding only the professional biography on his law firm's website. Princeton undergraduate, Harvard Law, specializing in corporate defense and government contracts. His client list was impressive but vague. Multinational corporations, government contractors, defense industry leaders. No specific mention of Atlas Security Solutions, but that didn't mean anything. Law firms often kept their most controversial clients off their public-facing materials. Emma's apartment was small: one bedroom, a kitchenette, and a living area barely large enough for a couch and the coffee table that currently served as her desk. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television, the dialogue from some crime drama providing an ironic soundtrack to her research. As midnight approached, Emma compiled a comprehensive list of parts needed for the truck restoration, trying to focus on the mechanical challenge ahead rather than the mysteries surrounding it. But the image of Thomas's face when Calvin mentioned Daniel's death kept intruding on her thoughts. She sent emails to several specialty parts suppliers, requesting quotes and availability information. Most of what she needed could be found through traditional channels, but some components for a 55 F-100 would require connections to collectors and enthusiasts. Emma had cultivated those connections over years of working on classic vehicles, another legacy from her grandfather. Finally, exhaustion overtook curiosity, and Emma closed her laptop. In the bathroom, she washed the day's grime from her hands, the strong degreaser turning the water a murky gray. Her reflection in the mirror showed smudges of oil still on her forehead and cheek. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, testaments to too many late nights and early mornings. Emma Barrett had never considered herself particularly brave or adventurous. She fixed machines, not problems. She restored what was broken, not what was lost. Yet somehow she had stumbled into a mystery that might have already cost one man his life. As she lay in bed, the weight of that responsibility pressed down on her. Daniel Reynolds had died trying to expose whatever secrets he had discovered. Thomas Reynolds had spent 20 years grieving his son, unable to move forward. And now Emma held the keys, perhaps literally, to unlocking the truth. Sometimes the most important things we fix aren't made of metal and rubber. Sometimes they're the broken pieces of truth that lie scattered across years of silence and grief. For Emma Barrett, the journey ahead would require all her mechanical skill and courage she didn't yet know she possessed. The morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only October in Kentucky can deliver. Emma arrived at the Reynolds farm early, her truck loaded with initial supplies, and her mind filled with questions she wasn't sure she should ask. Some truths are like engines. Disassemble them carelessly, and you might never get them running again. Thomas was waiting on the porch, 2 mugs of coffee steaming in the cool air. His nod of greeting was marginally warmer than yesterday's. Progress comes in small increments, Emma thought, like restoring an engine one careful part at a time. The barn felt different in the morning light, less a mausoleum and more a workshop awaiting purpose. The Ford F-100 sat patiently, as though it had been waiting all these years for someone to uncover its secrets. "Where do we start?" Thomas asked, setting his coffee on a workbench and gripping his cane with both hands. Emma pulled on her work gloves, surveying the truck with professional assessment. "First, we document everything. Take photos, notes, measurements. Then we'll remove the body from the frame. It's the only way to do a proper restoration." As they worked through the morning, Emma showed Thomas how to properly photograph each component before removal, explaining the restoration process step by step. His hands, though stiffened by age and arthritis, still remembered the tools they had once wielded with confidence. When he struggled with a particularly stubborn bolt, Emma pretended not to notice, busying herself with another task until he managed on his own. "You remind me of Daniel," Thomas said suddenly, breaking a long silence. He had that same patience with machines, like they were puzzles to be solved, not obstacles to be conquered. Emma glanced up, surprised by the personal observation. "My grandfather used to say that force was the last resort of the incompetent mechanic. Engines respond better to understanding than to brute strength." A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "Your grandfather and my son would have gotten along." By midday, they had made good progress documenting the truck's condition. Emma worked methodically, but her attention was divided. One part focused on the legitimate restoration, another searching for any hiding places where Daniel might have concealed evidence. As Thomas went to the house to prepare lunch, Emma carefully examined the underside of the dashboard, finding nothing unusual. The glove compartment contained only the original owner's manual and maintenance records, meticulously kept until 20 years ago, when entries abruptly stopped. It was when she removed the bench seat that Emma made her first real discovery. The seat mounting bolts showed scratch marks inconsistent with factory installation. Someone had removed and replaced this seat relatively recently. Examining the seat frame more closely, Emma found a cleverly disguised compartment that had been added after manufacture. Her heart raced as she reached inside and extracted a small USB drive, wrapped in protective plastic and electrical tape. She quickly pocketed the device, just as Thomas's uneven footsteps approached the barn door. Whatever Daniel had discovered, part of it might now be in her pocket, and with it, perhaps the real reason he had died. The restoration of the Ford F-100 had begun, but another restoration was also underway. The restoration of truth, and perhaps justice for a man who had died trying to expose secrets that some would kill to protect. The next morning, Emma arrived at the Reynolds farm as the first hint of dawn colored the eastern sky. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with fragmented images of Daniel Reynolds, a man she'd never met but whose presence now haunted her waking hours. The USB drive felt like a live coal in her pocket, too dangerous to ignore, too valuable to discard. Thomas was already in the barn, his arthritis apparently giving him no more rest than Emma's conscience had given her. He stood before the partially disassembled truck, one hand resting on the fender as though drawing strength from the connection. "You're early," he observed, not turning to look at her. "Lots to do," Emma replied, setting down her toolbox. "I thought we'd start on the engine today." Working on the engine would give her legitimate reason to search for more hidden compartments or evidence. The straight-six engine of the F-100 was simpler than modern engines, But that simplicity meant fewer places to conceal anything. If Daniel had hidden something there, it would take careful disassembly to find it. They worked in comfortable silence for the first hour, the barn gradually brightening as the sun climbed higher. Emma showed Thomas how to properly document each component before removal, explaining the restoration process step by step. For all his initial gruffness, Thomas proved to be an attentive student, his hands remembering skills long dormant. "This carburetor," Thomas said, holding the corroded component, "my father taught me how to rebuild it when I was 15. Said a man should understand what makes things move." He turned it in his hands, examining the decades of neglect. "Funny the things that stick with you. Can't remember what I had for dinner 2 days ago, but I can still hear him explaining how fuel turns to vapor." Emma nodded, understanding. Her own grandfather had taught her similar lessons, knowledge transferred from one generation to the next like a sacred trust. Some skills get embedded in your hands. They don't forget, even when your mind might. As they worked, Thomas gradually shared fragments of his life, his childhood on the farm, his time in Vietnam, his marriage to a woman named Martha who had died of cancer 5 years before Daniel's death. Each revelation was like a small key, unlocking another chamber of the fortress Thomas had built around himself. "Daniel was all I had left," he said quietly, as they carefully removed the radiator. "After Martha died, he was my only family. My brother Richard, Calvin's father, and I weren't close. Different paths, different values." "What was Daniel like?" Emma asked, seizing the opening to learn more about the man whose secrets she now carried. Thomas's weathered face softened. "Smart, too smart for his own good sometimes. Could have gone anywhere, done anything. But he had this sense of duty, enlisted right after 9/11. Said someone had to stand up for what was right." His voice caught. He got that from his mother. Emma focused on loosening a stubborn bolt, giving Thomas space to compose himself. "And he was in Army intelligence?" "Communications intelligence. Spoke Arabic, Farsi too. Had a gift for languages." Pride momentarily overcame grief in Thomas's voice. His second tour was different, though. Came back changed, quieter. Kept things to himself. "When was that?" Emma kept her tone casual, though her heart raced. 2004. He discharged in early 2005. 6 months later, Thomas's hand tightened on the wrench he was holding. "They said PTSD, said he couldn't adjust to civilian life. But Daniel wasn't the type to give up. He was working on something important." Before Emma could probe further, the sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Thomas tensed, but relaxed marginally when Frank Mason's weathered pickup came into view. Frank carried a cardboard box as he entered the barn. "Morning all. Brought those specialty tools I mentioned. And some coffee that doesn't taste like Thomas made it." The momentary lightness was welcome. Frank set the box down and distributed paper cups of steaming coffee from the local diner. The normalcy of the gesture, 3 people sharing coffee in a barn on a crisp autumn morning, belied the undercurrents of danger and secrecy that Emma now felt swirling around them. Frank surveyed their progress with an approving eye. "You've got the patient opened up nicely. What's the diagnosis, Doc?" Emma wiped her hands on a rag. "The engine's repairable, seized from sitting too long, but no terminal damage. The transmission's another story. We'll need to completely rebuild it." "And the brakes," Thomas added. "Someone cut the lines." The casual way he mentioned this significant detail made Emma glance up sharply. So he had noticed the sabotage too. Frank's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Around midday, Thomas excused himself to make lunch, leaving Emma and Frank alone with the truck. The moment the barn door closed behind him, Frank's demeanor changed. "Did you find anything?" he asked in a low voice, his eyes scanning the barn as though checking for surveillance. Emma hesitated, unsure how much to trust him. "Maybe. I need to know more about Daniel first, and about Atlas Security." Frank's jaw tightened. Atlas started as a legitimate security contractor. Protection details for diplomats, training for foreign military allies. Then they got into special operations, black ops without the oversight. By the time Daniel encountered them in Iraq, they were neck-deep in things that wouldn't stand the light of day. What kind of things? Weapons smuggling, diverting military supplies to the black market. Maybe worse. Frank lowered his voice further. Daniel stumbled onto something big, some kind of off-books operation. He started gathering evidence, building a case. Why didn't he take it to his superiors? Frank's laugh was bitter. Because Atlas had people everywhere. Military, State Department, Congress. Daniel didn't know who to trust. He glanced toward the barn door. He trusted his father, and me, said he was gathering everything on secure storage, digital and physical backups. Emma thought of the USB drive in her pocket. And then he died. Bullet to the right temple, his service weapon, perfect suicide scene. Frank's eyes were hard, except Daniel was left-handed. The implications of this hit Emma like a physical blow. Did the police, local police, not FBI, small-town department with limited resources? Atlas has connections everywhere. The investigation was closed within a week. And Thomas? Did he challenge the ruling? Frank's expression softened with sorrow. Thomas was destroyed. Lost his wife, then his son. He just shut down. By the time he started asking questions, the trail was cold. Until now, Emma said. What changed? Why is he restoring the truck after all these years? Frank checked the barn door again before answering. 3 months ago, Thomas received an anonymous package. Photos from Iraq, Daniel with his unit, and a note. The truth is in the truck. That's all. Emma's mind raced. Calvin knows something. He's nervous about the truck being restored. Calvin is deeply involved with Atlas. Legal counsel, but more than that, he's their fixer when problems arise. Frank's expression was grim. And right now, you and Thomas are problems. Why are you telling me this? Why trust me? Frank studied her face. Because Daniel would have. He had good instincts about people. And because I've been carrying this alone for 20 years. He sighed heavily. I tried to help Daniel gather evidence. Not enough, not in time. This might be my last chance to make it right. The barn door creaked, signaling Thomas's return. Frank quickly resumed work on the engine. The transition so smooth that Emma marveled at his self-control. Whatever else Frank Mason might be, he was a man accustomed to compartmentalizing, keeping secrets locked away in separate chambers of his mind. After lunch, they focused on removing the engine entirely, a process that required careful coordination. The years had made it one with the frame, rust, and corrosion fusing metal to metal in stubborn union. Emma rigged a makeshift engine hoist using the barn's rafters and pulleys, demonstrating an ingenuity that earned appreciative nods from both men. With the engine removed, Emma had clear access to the transmission and the firewall, the metal barrier separating the engine compartment from the passenger cabin. It was here that her careful inspection revealed another anomaly. A section of the firewall had been cut and re-welded, the work so skillful it was nearly invisible. That's not factory, she remarked, running her fingers along the seam. Thomas frowned. Daniel was handy with a welder, learned in high school shop class. Emma tapped the metal, noting the hollow sound. There was a space behind it, a cavity that shouldn't exist. We'll need to open this up. It might be hiding structural damage. The excuse was flimsy, but Thomas didn't question it. He seemed to understand that they were looking for more than just mechanical problems. With careful work, they cut along the weld lines, removing a rectangular section of metal about 12 inches square. Inside the hidden compartment was a flat metal box, sealed with solder around its edges. Thomas stared at it, his breath catching. That's Daniel's work. I recognize the welding pattern. Emma carefully extracted the box. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, the metal cool against her skin. This was no hasty hiding place. This had been planned, prepared with precision. Daniel Reynolds had meant for this to be found, but only by someone who would disassemble the truck completely. Should we open it? She asked, though the question seemed redundant. Thomas nodded, his expression a complex mixture of hope and dread. After dinner, I need a moment. Emma understood. Whatever the box contained, it represented the last communication from his son. The final pieces of a puzzle, 20 years in the making. Such revelations required preparation, like bracing before impact. As the afternoon light began to fade, they secured the barn, placing the metal box and the disassembled engine components in a locked toolbox. Thomas invited Emma to stay for dinner, an offer that surprised her but which she gratefully accepted. The mystery of the truck now bound them together in ways that transcended the professional relationship of mechanic and client. Dinner was simple. Beef stew that Thomas had started in a slow cooker that morning, crusty bread from the local bakery. They ate at a worn oak table, the silence occasionally broken by discussions of the truck's restoration timeline or the parts they would need to order. Finally, Thomas pushed his empty bowl aside. "Let's see what my son left behind." They returned to the barn where Frank was already waiting, though Emma couldn't recall Thomas inviting or informing him. The metal box sat on the workbench, gleaming dully in the overhead lights. Thomas produced a small cutting torch. With steady hands belying his age, he carefully cut along the soldered seam, the metal parting reluctantly to reveal its contents. A microfilm reel, a small notebook with a weathered cover, and a sealed envelope with "Dem" written in a firm hand. Thomas's fingers trembled as he lifted the envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, the seal intact. For 20 years, this message had waited in darkness, a voice from beyond the grave. Thomas opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet inside. He read in silence, his expression changing from anticipation to confusion to a kind of vindicated grief. When he finished, he handed the letter to Emma without a word. The handwriting was neat but hurried. "Dad, if you're reading this, something's happened to me. I've uncovered something big. War crimes, weapons trafficking, money laundering. Atlas Security isn't just a contractor. They're running their own operations using U.S. military resources and protection. I've gathered evidence, financial records, mission logs, photographs, testimony. It's all here and on the microfilm. There's also a backup on a USB drive hidden under the driver's seat. Trust no one with this except Frank. And if anything happens to me, look at my death very carefully. I'm not suicidal, Dad, no matter what they might make it look like. I love you. I'm sorry for the burden this places on you, but the truth matters. It's worth fighting for, worth dying for, if necessary." Daniel Emma looked up to find both men watching her. Thomas with grief etched deep in the lines of his face, Frank with a complex mixture of vindication and guilt. "He knew," Thomas said quietly. "He knew they might kill him." Frank nodded grimly. "And they made it look like suicide, just like he predicted." Emma thought of the USB drive in her pocket, the missing piece of Daniel's evidence cache. She should tell them now, reveal what she'd found. But something held her back. A cautious voice whispering that secrets revealed couldn't be unrevealed, that knowledge was both power and danger. "We need to look at everything," she said instead. "The notebook, the microfilm. Understand what Daniel found before we decide what to do." Thomas retrieved a battered microfilm viewer from a cabinet, a relic from his days working at the county records office after Vietnam. "Never thought I'd use this again," he murmured, setting it up on the workbench. The microfilm contained what appeared to be financial records, spreadsheets, bank transfers, shell company structures. Emma was no accountant, but even she could see the circular money flows designed to obscure origins and destinations. Millions of dollars moving through a labyrinth of corporate entities, eventually disappearing into numbered accounts. The notebook proved more immediately revealing. Daniel had kept a meticulous record of observations, conversations, and connections. Names appeared repeatedly. General William Hargrove, Pentagon liaison to private contractors, Senator James Mercer, member of the Armed Services Committee, and most frequently, Calvin Reynolds, listed as legal counsel, but clearly involved in operational decisions. One entry made Emma's blood run cold. Octi 3, 2004, Atlas moving weapons through Fallujah. Not standard military issue. Soviet-era RPGs, Chinese rifles. Destination unclear. CR handling paperwork, ensuring oversight compliance. His words. When questioned, told me some things better left unexamined. Implied threat? Must gather more evidence. Calvin was directly involved, Thomas said, his voice hollow with disbelief. My own nephew. Frank's expression was grim. Family connections made him valuable to them. Who would suspect? As they delved deeper into Daniel's records, a disturbing picture emerged. Atlas Security had been using military operations as cover for weapons trafficking, moving arms to various factions in Iraq and Afghanistan. The profits funded black operations that even the Pentagon wasn't aware of or was deliberately ignoring. This is bigger than we thought, Frank said, staring at a list of high-ranking officials implicated in the scheme. These people, they're still in power, still protected, and still dangerous, Emma added, thinking of Calvin's thinly veiled threats. Thomas looked up from the notebook, his eyes hard with a determination Emma hadn't seen before. Daniel died for this truth. I won't let it stay buried any longer. We need to be careful, Frank cautioned. These people have resources, connections. They've killed before. I have the truck, Thomas countered. I have my son's evidence. What more do we need? Emma hesitated, then made her decision. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the USB drive. We need this, she said, placing it on the workbench. I found it yesterday, hidden under the driver's seat, just like Daniel's letter said. Thomas stared at the small device as though it might explode. You found this? And didn't tell me? I needed to be sure, Emma said, meeting his accusatory gaze. Sure of what we're dealing with, sure of who to trust. And now? Frank asked quietly. Emma looked between the two men. Thomas Reynolds, broken by grief but driven by a father's need for justice. Frank Mason, carrying 20 years of guilt for failing to protect his friend's son. Both had reasons to pursue the truth. Both had reasons to fear it. Now we need to be smart, she said. Daniel died because he tried to gather evidence alone. We need to be more careful, more strategic. Thomas picked up the USB drive, turning it in his gnarled fingers. What do you suggest? We continue restoring the truck, Emma said. It's our cover story, our reason for being together. Meanwhile, we examine everything Daniel left us, create copies, find someone we can trust with this information, someone with the power to protect us and act on it. A journalist? Frank suggested. Emma shook her head. Too easy to discredit or intimidate. We need someone in federal law enforcement. FBI, not local police. I don't have those kinds of connections, Thomas said. But Grace Wilson might, Emma replied, remembering the Veterans Committee chairwoman who had connected her with Thomas. She knows people in Washington through her veterans advocacy work. Frank nodded slowly. That could work. Grace is solid, incorruptible. And Calvin won't suspect her, Thomas added. She's been trying to get me to join the Veterans Committee for years. A meeting with her wouldn't raise flags. As they formulated their plan, Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had come here to restore a truck, not to uncover government corruption and corporate criminality. Yet somehow she had become essential to this mission, this quest for justice that had already claimed one life. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her grandfather had taught her to fix machines, to restore what time and neglect had broken. Now she found herself trying to repair something far more complex and fragile. The truth of a young soldier's death, the broken heart of a grieving father, the corrupted machinery of power and accountability. As midnight approached, they had established their next steps. Thomas would reach out to Grace Wilson, arrange a meeting under the pretext of discussing the upcoming Veterans Day parade. Frank would use his own connections to verify some of the names in Daniel's notes, see who was still active and potentially dangerous. Emma would continue the restoration work, maintaining their cover while searching for any additional evidence Daniel might have hidden in the truck. Before leaving, Emma copied the contents of the USB drive onto her laptop. The files were encrypted, but a simple text document on the drive provided the password, Martha's birthday. Thomas supplied the date, August 17, 1947, and the files opened to reveal a treasure trove of documentation, photographs of weapons shipments, audio recordings of conversations between Atlas executives and military officials, scanned contracts with suspicious amendments. He was thorough, Frank remarked, a note of pride in his voice. Built a case no one could dismiss. Except they did, Thomas said bitterly. They killed him and buried the evidence, and I let them. You didn't know, Emma said gently, and now you do. We all do. As she drove home through the darkness, Emma felt as though she had crossed a threshold. The restoration of the Ford F-100 had become a restoration of truth, of justice, a vehicle carrying not just the memory of Thomas's son, but his final mission. Her apartment felt particularly empty when she returned. the silence oppressive after the intensity of the evening's discoveries. Emma secured her copy of Daniel's files on an encrypted external drive, which she hid inside the hollow base of a lamp, a hiding place her grandfather had created years ago for keeping emergency cash. Sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel Reynolds, a man she knew only from photographs and his father's memories, working alone in that barn, welding a secret compartment into his father's truck, writing a letter he hoped would never need to be read. What must it be like to discover something so terrible that you know it might get you killed? To gather evidence methodically, meticulously, knowing that each document increased the danger? To prepare contingencies, hiding your findings where only the right person might find them? And what about Calvin Reynolds? How did a man become so corrupted that he would participate in the death of his own cousin? Was it greed, ambition, or something more complex, a gradual slide into moral compromise until murder became just another transaction? These questions followed Emma into uneasy dreams, where she found herself working on an engine that kept changing shape, its components rearranging themselves every time she looked away. A voice kept whispering, "The truth is in the truck." But no matter how many parts she removed, the engine's core remained elusive, hidden behind layers of steel and secrets. Morning came too soon, gray light filtering through cheap blinds as Emma's alarm dragged her from fitful sleep. She showered quickly, the hot water doing little to wash away her sense of foreboding. Today they would continue the restoration, maintain the pretense of normality while planning their next move. It felt like walking willingly into quicksand. When she arrived at the Reynolds farm, Thomas was already in the barn, but he wasn't alone. A petite woman with auburn hair streaked with gray stood beside him, examining the disassembled truck with evident interest. She turned as Emma entered, revealing an intelligent face with laugh lines around the eyes. "You must be Emma," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Grace Wilson. Thomas has told me about the restoration project." Emma shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. "Nice to meet you in person, Mrs. Wilson. Thank you for connecting me with this job." Grace smiled, but her eyes were serious. "Thomas has also told me about other aspects of this project. I believe we have matters to discuss." So Thomas had already reached out to Grace, accelerating their timeline. Emma glanced at him questioningly. "Grace came by early," Thomas explained. "I thought it best to bring her up to speed immediately." "The truck isn't the only thing that's been neglected for 20 years, Grace said, her tone gentle but firm. "It's time for truth to see daylight." Something in her manner inspired confidence. Grace Wilson carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to navigating bureaucracies and cutting through red tape. If anyone could help them find the right people to trust with Daniel's evidence, it would be her. "Frank will be here soon," Thomas said. "Then we can talk properly." As if summoned by his name, Frank's truck appeared in the driveway. He entered the barn with a newspaper tucked under his arm, his expression tight with concern. "We may have a problem," he announced without preamble. He spread the newspaper on the workbench. The headline read, "Local Veteran's Death Under Review." The article was brief but detailed. The Kentucky State Police had quietly reopened the investigation into Daniel Reynolds' death after new evidence called the suicide ruling into question. The nature of this evidence wasn't specified, but the article mentioned that investigators had visited the Reynolds farm while Thomas was away at a VA appointment 2 days earlier. "They were here?" Thomas looked stunned. "In my house?" "With a warrant, apparently," Frank said grimly. "Signed by Judge Carlton." "Carlton is Calvin's golf partner," Grace noted, her lips thinning. "This isn't coincidence." Emma's mind raced. "Calvin mentioned an inquiry when he was here. He's trying to get ahead of us, control the narrative." "Or find Daniel's evidence before we can use it," Frank added. Thomas sank onto a nearby stool, suddenly looking every one of his 67 years. All this time, 20 years of nothing, and now suddenly everyone's interested in how my boy died. Grace placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Because someone's scared, Thomas. After all this time, something's changed. Something's made them nervous." "The truck," Emma said quietly. "The restoration. Calvin knows Daniel hid something here." Frank nodded. "And now they're watching us. That article is a warning and a probe. They want to see how we react." "So what do we do?" Thomas asked, looking between them. Grace straightened, decision crystallizing in her expression. We continue exactly as planned. The restoration proceeds normally. Meanwhile, I have a friend at the Department of Justice, someone I trust completely. She specializes in contractor fraud cases. Can she protect us? Emma asked. Once she has the evidence, yes. She can initiate a federal investigation, get protection for key witnesses. Grace looked at each of them in turn. But until then, we maintain absolute normalcy. No suspicious behavior, no secret meetings, nothing that might tip them off. Frank rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. They'll be watching more closely now, maybe even surveillance. Then we give them nothing to see, Grace said firmly. Just an old man restoring his truck with help from a skilled mechanic and old friends. The strategy was sound, but Emma couldn't shake her unease. They were amateurs going up against professionals, people who had successfully covered up criminal activity for decades, who had arranged at least one murder and made it look like suicide. Yet what choice did they have? Daniel Reynolds had died trying to expose the truth. His father had spent 20 years in grief and isolation. And now Emma herself was inextricably linked to their story, her fate bound up with theirs whether she'd chosen it or not. Sometimes the most important repairs aren't to engines or bodywork, but to the broken machinery of justice. Emma Barrett had never considered herself particularly brave, but as she looked at the disassembled truck, at the tangible evidence of Daniel's final act of courage, she knew there was no turning back. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she would face them alongside Thomas, Frank, and Grace. The restoration had to continue, not just of the Ford F-100, but of the truth it contained. As Grace and Frank discussed the logistics of securing and transferring Daniel's evidence, Emma returned to the practical work of restoration. She began cleaning engine components, a task that required focus and precision. The methodical work helped calm her racing thoughts, grounding her in the physical world of metal and grease. Thomas joined her, their hands working in companionable silence. Despite the danger swirling around them, there was something profoundly normal about this shared labor, this process of taking something broken and making it whole again. Did I ever tell you why I kept this truck all these years? Thomas asked suddenly, his hands steady as he cleaned decades of grime from a valve cover. Emma shook her head. When Daniel was little, maybe 5 or 6, he used to beg me to take him for rides. He'd sit right here. Thomas patted the spot where the bench seat would go and pretend he was driving. Make engine noises, turn an imaginary steering wheel. Thomas smiled at the memory, his weathered face momentarily youthful. One day he asked me, Dad, when I grow up, can this be my truck? I told him, of course, that his grandfather had given it to me, and someday I'd give it to him. He paused, his hands stilling on the valve cover. After he died, I couldn't bear to look at it. Couldn't sell it either. So it sat here waiting. For 20 years it sat here. And now we're bringing it back to life, Emma said softly. Thomas nodded, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. Daniel would have liked that. He always believed things could be fixed, made right again. He looked directly at Emma then, his gaze surprisingly clear and determined. He was right about that. Some things just take longer to repair than others. In that moment, Emma understood that the restoration of the Ford F-100 wasn't just about uncovering hidden evidence or seeking justice for Daniel's death. It was Thomas Reynolds' way of honoring a promise made to a 5-year-old boy decades ago, a promise that had survived grief, isolation, and the long, slow damage of time. Some promises, like some machines, are built to endure, and Emma Barrett was determined to help this one reach fulfillment, whatever the cost. Over the next week, the restoration progressed with methodical precision. Emma and Thomas fell into a comfortable rhythm, their hands working in tandem as they rebuilt the F-100's mechanical heart. To any observer, they were simply a talented mechanic and a determined old man bringing a classic truck back to life. But beneath this ordinary surface, currents of tension and purpose ran deep. Grace Wilson had arranged for her Department of Justice contact to visit Pinewood the following week. Until then, they needed to maintain their cover while continuing to piece together the full extent of Atlas Securities operations and Calvin's involvement. Emma arrived at the farm earlier than usual one morning, hoping to examine the truck's frame more thoroughly before Thomas joined her. The silence of the barn was broken only by birdsong and the occasional rustle of field mice in the hayloft. As she slid beneath the chassis, her flashlight illuminated the truck's underside, decades of dirt and grease, but also the solid bones of American manufacturing. She worked her way methodically from front to back, tapping sections of the frame to check for hidden compartments. Near where the bed connected to the chassis, she discovered another anomaly, a patch of metal that sounded different from the rest. Closer inspection revealed nearly invisible welds, similar to those on the firewall compartment. Found something? Thomas's voice startled her. Emma slid out from under the truck, wiping her hands on a rag. Maybe. There's another hidden compartment in the frame rail. Thomas knelt beside her, his movements stiff but determined. Together they examined the section, devising a way to access it without compromising the frame's structural integrity. We'll need to drill access points and use a metal saw, Emma decided. It'll take precision work. By midday, they had carefully cut an opening in the frame rail. Inside was a slim metal tube, sealed at both ends. Thomas extracted it with trembling hands, his expression a mixture of hope and dread. "This is military-grade waterproof storage," he said, examining the container. Daniel had one for his deployment documents. They opened it carefully. Inside was a roll of microfilm different from the one they had already discovered, along with a small key with no identifying marks. "Another piece of the puzzle," Emma murmured. Before they could examine the microfilm, the sound of tires on gravel alerted them to a visitor. Thomas hastily pocketed the tube's contents as Calvin's black SUV came into view. "Act normal," Thomas said under his breath. "Follow my lead." Calvin entered the barn with the confident stride of someone who believed in his own authority. Today he wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Emma made in 2 months, his shoes gleaming despite the dusty driveway. "Uncle Thomas," he greeted with practiced warmth. "Miss Barrett, I see the restoration is coming along." "What do you want, Calvin?" Thomas asked bluntly. Calvin's smile didn't falter. "I came to apologize for my abruptness during my last visit, and to check on your progress." His gaze swept over the disassembled truck. "It seems you are quite serious about this project." "Emma knows what she's doing," Thomas said. "She's rebuilding it right, not just patching it up." Calvin nodded appreciatively, though his eyes remained calculating. "I can see that. Quality work deserves recognition." He turned to Emma. "Which is why I'd like to offer you a job, Miss Barrett." Emma froze, caught off guard. "A job?" "My firm represents several high-end automotive restoration companies. They're always looking for talented mechanics. The pay would be substantial, significantly more than you're making here." The offer was so unexpected that Emma almost laughed. This was a bribe thinly disguised as an opportunity, a way to separate her from Thomas and the evidence they were uncovering. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I've committed to finishing this project." Of course, Calvin said smoothly. "The offer stands whenever you're ready, just something to consider for your future." He turned back to Thomas. "Uncle, I also wanted to inform you personally that there's been a development regarding Daniel's case. The state police are reinvestigating his death." "I saw the newspaper," Thomas said evenly. "Then you know they may want to speak with you. I'd be happy to be present as your legal counsel when they do." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. If Thomas accepted Calvin's offer of legal representation, it would give Calvin access to everything Thomas told the police. If he refused, it might seem suspicious. "That won't be necessary," Thomas replied. "I have nothing to hide." Calvin's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Everyone needs legal protection, Uncle. Even, perhaps especially, the innocent." "I'll keep that in mind." Calvin lingered for another 15 minutes, asking pointed questions about the restoration process and making observations about the truck. His eyes continually scanned the barn, as though searching for something out of place. Finally, he checked his watch, a gesture that seemed calculated rather than necessary. "I should get going. I have a meeting in Louisville this afternoon." He handed Emma a business card. "Call me when you're ready to discuss that opportunity, Miss Barrett." After Calvin departed, Emma and Thomas waited in tense silence until the sound of his SUV faded completely. "He's fishing," Thomas said grimly, "trying to figure out what we know." "And offering me a bribe to walk away," Emma added, tossing Calvin's card onto the workbench. They returned to the newly discovered microfilm, setting up the viewer Thomas had used for the previous role. This film contains something entirely different: photographs. Dozens of them, showing weapons transfers at remote desert locations, men in military and civilian clothing unloading crates from trucks. In several images, Calvin Reynolds was clearly visible, directing operations while holding a clipboard. More damning were the photographs of meetings in hotel rooms and restaurants, showing Calvin with military officers and men identified in Daniel's notes as insurgent leaders. These weren't just weapons transfers. They were deals with both sides of the conflict. "My God," Thomas whispered. They were arming everyone: military, insurgents, anyone who could pay. "Or further their interests," Emma added, studying a particularly clear image of Calvin shaking hands with a man whose face had been circled in Daniel's photographs. This must be what got Daniel killed. The small key remained a mystery. It was too small for a padlock, more like a key for a safety deposit box or a locker. With no identifying marks, they had no way to determine what it might open. That evening, Frank joined them to review their discoveries. His reaction to the new microfilm was grim satisfaction. "This ties Calvin directly to the operations," he said, "not just as legal counsel, but as an active participant." "But what's the key for?" Emma wondered. Frank examined it carefully. "Looks like a safety deposit box key. Daniel might have secured additional evidence somewhere." "But where?" Thomas asked. "What bank?" "Could be anywhere," Frank admitted. "Daniel traveled to Louisville and Lexington regularly after his discharge. Said he was job hunting, but he was building his case," Thomas finished, "setting up fallback plans." Emma thought about Daniel's methodical approach, the careful way he had hidden evidence in multiple locations within the truck. He wouldn't have made it impossible to figure out. He wanted this evidence found, but only by the right people. "There might be a clue in his papers," Frank suggested. "Something we overlooked." They returned to Daniel's notebook, poring over entries from his final months. Most were observations about Atlas operations, but occasionally he mentioned personal errands: a dentist appointment in Louisville, dinner with Kate in Lexington, a visit to his mother's grave in Pinewood Cemetery. "Wait," Emma said, pointing to an entry from 3 weeks before Daniel's death. "Look at this." The entry read, "Mom's birthday, left flowers, also secured package at First Federal, access info in usual place." "First Federal Bank," Thomas said. "They have branches in Louisville and Lexington." "And here in Pinewood," Frank added. "It's the only bank in town." "But what's the usual place?" Emma wondered. "Where would Daniel have left access information?" Thomas's expression shifted as realization dawned. "Martha's grave. That's what left flowers means. He must have hidden something at his mother's gravesite." The Pinewood Cemetery was a small, well-maintained plot of land adjacent to the Baptist church on the edge of town. Even in darkness, Thomas had no trouble locating his wife's grave, a modest headstone beneath a spreading oak tree. Emma and Frank hung back, giving him a moment of privacy as he stood before the marker. After a respectful pause, Thomas beckoned them forward. "Martha always loved puzzles," he said quietly. "She taught Daniel to love them too. If he left a message here, it would be something only I would understand." Thomas examined the headstone carefully, running his fingers along the edges and base. Finding nothing, he knelt and inspected the small brass vase attached to the side of the marker. "Here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Removing the vase, he revealed a small waterproof container wedged into the bracket. Inside was a piece of paper with a series of numbers: 35, 17, 42, 08. "A combination," Frank said. "For a safety deposit box," Emma confirmed. "But which branch?" "Has to be here in Pinewood," Thomas decided. "Daniel would have known I rarely traveled to the cities. He'd want to make it accessible to me." They agreed to visit Pinewood's First Federal branch the next morning. As they walked back to their vehicles, Emma noticed a sedan parked across from the cemetery, its headlights off. When Frank's truck started up, the sedan's lights came on, and it pulled away smoothly. "We're being watched," she said quietly. Frank nodded. "Probably have been since Calvin's visit. We'll need to be careful tomorrow." Emma spent another restless night, her mind racing with the implications of what they had uncovered. Atlas Security wasn't just engaging in isolated incidents of corruption. They were running a systematic operation to profit from conflict, arming multiple sides while using U.S. military resources and protection. The scope was staggering, the moral bankruptcy complete. And Calvin Reynolds wasn't merely complicit, he was a key operator. Had he been involved in his own cousin's murder? The thought made Emma's stomach turn. The next morning, Emma met Thomas and Frank at a diner 2 blocks from First Federal Bank. Grace Wilson joined them, bringing news that her Justice Department contact would arrive the following day. Jennifer Lawson, Grace explained, we serve together on a Veterans Advocacy Committee. She specializes in contractor fraud cases and has the authority to initiate a federal investigation. Can we trust her? Frank asked. With our lives, Grace affirmed. She's turned down multiple private sector offers that would have tripled her salary. She believes in justice, not paydays. Their plan was simple but risky. Thomas would enter the bank alone to access the safety deposit box, claiming he needed some personal documents. The others would wait nearby, watching for any sign of surveillance or trouble. First Federal Bank of Pinewood occupied a red brick building on Main Street, its facade virtually unchanged since the 1950s. Thomas straightened his tie, a concession to formality he rarely made, and entered while the others positioned themselves at strategic points nearby. Emma waited in her truck, parked where she could observe both the bank entrance and the street. Through the bank's large windows, she could see Thomas speaking with a teller, then being escorted to a back room by the manager. 20 minutes passed, each minute stretching with tension. Finally, Thomas emerged, carrying nothing obvious but walking with a purpose that told Emma he'd found something significant. He didn't look in her direction but headed straight for his truck. As agreed, they reconvened at the farm, where Thomas produced a manila envelope from inside his jacket. Daniel's safety deposit box, he explained, his voice tight with emotion. The bank manager remembered him, said he came in about a month before he died, looking troubled but determined, as she put it. The envelope contained 2 items, a USB drive, similar to the one Emma had found under the truck's seat, and a letter addressed to federal authorities. The letter was a formal statement detailing Daniel's discoveries about Atlas Securities' illegal weapons trafficking, money laundering, and collusion with hostile forces in Iraq. The USB drive contained video files, recordings Daniel had secretly made during operations and meetings. In one particularly damning video, Calvin Reynolds could be seen explicitly discussing how to disguise weapons shipments as humanitarian aid. This completes the evidence chain, Frank said. Between this, the microfilm, and Daniel's notes, there's enough to trigger a full federal investigation. And to keep us all in protective custody until it's complete, Grace added. Jennifer will be here tomorrow. She can take official possession of everything then. That night, they decided that Emma would stay at the farm rather than return to her apartment. The surveillance they'd spotted at the cemetery was concerning, and it seemed safer to remain together. Thomas prepared the guest room, Daniel's old room, untouched since his death except for dusting. I couldn't change anything, Thomas explained as he provided fresh towels. Felt like I'd be erasing him somehow. The room was a time capsule of a young man's life interrupted. Military awards on the wall, books on the shelf, a Kentucky Wildcats pennant above the desk. Emma felt like an intruder in this preserved space, but also honored by the trust Thomas was showing her. After a simple dinner, they gathered in the living room to review their plan for meeting Jennifer Lawson the following day. The evidence would be presented, statements taken, and arrangements made for their protection during the investigation. Once the Justice Department has this, we are committed, Grace warned. There's no turning back. Daniel didn't turn back, Thomas said firmly. Neither will I. As the evening wound down, Emma stepped onto the porch for some air. The night was clear, stars brilliant above the rolling Kentucky hills. The peacefulness of the scene belied the danger they faced. The sound of tires on gravel shattered the tranquility. Headlights appeared at the end of the driveway, not one vehicle, but 3, approaching rapidly. Emma rushed inside. Someone's coming. Multiple vehicles. Frank moved to the window, peering through the curtains. Unmarked SUVs. Not police. No light bars. Thomas retrieved a shotgun from a cabinet, checking that it was loaded. Grace, take Emma and the evidence to the root cellar. There's an exit that leads to the woods behind the property. I'm not leaving you, Emma protested. This isn't a debate, Thomas said sharply. Daniel died for this evidence. It needs to reach the Justice Department no matter what. Grace took charge, gathering the evidence into a waterproof bag while Frank made a quick call on his cell phone. My contact at the sheriff's office, he explained, left a message about a possible break-in at this address. May buy us some time. The vehicles were getting closer. Emma could now see they were black SUVs similar to Calvin's, but with tinted windows that concealed the occupants. Go, Thomas urged. Now. Grace grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her toward the kitchen where a door led to the cellar. Emma resisted for a moment, looking back at Thomas standing resolute with his shotgun, and Frank positioning himself by another window with a handgun she hadn't known he carried. They need us to get this evidence out, Grace said firmly. It's what Daniel would have wanted. The logic was undeniable. Emma followed Grace through the kitchen and down the narrow stairs to the root cellar, a cool, earthy space lined with shelves of home-canned vegetables and preserves. At the back, behind a stack of empty crates, was a small door. Storm shelter exit, Grace explained, pushing aside the crates, common feature in tornado country. The door was stiff but opened with a firm push, revealing a short tunnel that emerged in a stand of trees about 50 yards from the house. As they crawled through, Emma heard the first shouts from the direction of the farmhouse, followed by the distinctive sound of Thomas's shotgun firing once. A warning shot. This way, Grace whispered, leading Emma deeper into the woods. They moved as quietly as possible through the underbrush, guided by moonlight filtering through the trees. Behind them, more shouts and a single gunshot echoed from the farmhouse. Emma's heart pounded as she thought of Thomas and Frank facing unknown assailants. Were they Atlas security personnel? Mercenaries hired to retrieve the evidence? Would Calvin be among them, finally showing his true colors? We need to circle around to the road, Grace said. I have a friend who lives about 2 miles from here. We can call for help from there. The woods were disorienting in darkness, branches catching at their clothing, unseen roots threatening to trip them with each step. Emma followed Grace's lead, trusting the older woman's surprising woodland skills. Grew up hunting with my father, Grace explained quietly, noticing Emma's unasked question. Know these woods almost as well as Thomas does. They had covered perhaps half a mile when headlights appeared on a service road ahead of them. Grace pulled Emma down into a thicket of undergrowth. Don't move, she whispered. A vehicle moved slowly along the road, a spotlight sweeping the trees on either side. Men's voices carried in the still night air, though the words were indistinct. They're searching the property perimeter, Grace breathed. They must have anticipated we'd run. The vehicle passed without detecting them, but its presence confirmed their fears. This was a coordinated operation with multiple personnel and vehicles. Whoever had come for the evidence had come prepared. They continued through the woods, now moving more cautiously, stopping frequently to listen for pursuers. The distant sound of sirens suggested Frank's call to the sheriff's office had been effective, but would help arrive in time? After what seemed like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, they reached the edge of the woods where the trees gave way to open fields. About a quarter mile away, a farmhouse similar to Thomas's stood dark except for a single porch light. That's Ellie Harmon's place, Grace said. She's a retired nurse, keeps to herself mostly, but she's trustworthy. They were half-on across the open field when a spotlight caught them in its glare. An engine roared as a vehicle accelerated toward them from a side road. Run! Grace shouted, pushing Emma toward the farmhouse. They sprinted across the uneven ground, the vehicle gaining on them with every second. The farmhouse was still too far. They wouldn't make it before the vehicle intercepted them. Take this! Grace thrust the waterproof bag containing the evidence into Emma's hands. Don't stop no matter what! Before Emma could protest, Grace changed direction, running at an angle away from her. The spotlight followed Grace, temporarily leaving Emma in darkness. She ran harder than she'd ever run in her life, lungs burning, legs pumping. Behind her, she heard the vehicle skid to a stop, car doors opening, men shouting. A cry of pain, Grace's voice. Emma wanted desperately to turn back, to help, but the weight of the evidence bag reminded her of what was at stake. Daniel's evidence, Thomas's 20-year quest for truth, Frank's chance for redemption, Grace's sacrifice. All of it would be meaningless if the evidence didn't reach the Justice Department. Emma reached the farmhouse and pounded on the door, gasping for breath. After an agonizing wait, a light came on inside, and an elderly woman's voice called out, "Who's there?" "Please," Emma managed between gasps. I'm a friend of Grace Wilson. I need help. The door opened a crack, revealing a white-haired woman in a bathrobe, holding a cordless phone ready to dial. Grace Wilson sent you? At this hour? Please, Emma repeated. There are men after me. They've hurt Grace. We need to call the police. The mention of Grace being hurt seemed to convince the woman. She opened the door wider, ushering Emma inside and quickly locking it behind her. I'm Ellie, she said, already dialing the phone. What kind of trouble are you in, girl? Before Emma could answer, headlights swept across the front windows as a vehicle pulled into the driveway. Men's voices approached the porch. Is there another way out? Emma asked urgently. Ellie pointed toward the kitchen. Back door leads to the garage. My car's in there. Keys are in the ceramic frog on the shelf. The sound of heavy fists pounding on the front door galvanized them both. Ellie spoke rapidly into the phone, reporting a home invasion to the 911 operator as she guided Emma toward the kitchen. Go, she whispered. I'll stall them. Emma slipped through the kitchen as the pounding at the front door intensified. Through a window, she could see at least 3 men on the porch, one of them reaching inside his jacket in a way that suggested a concealed weapon. The garage was dark, but faint moonlight through a dusty window revealed an older model Buick. Emma found the ceramic frog, retrieved the keys, and slid into the driver's seat as quietly as possible. From inside the house came the sound of breaking glass. They were forcing their way in. Emma started the car, fumbling in the unfamiliar controls for the garage door opener. Finding a button on the visor, she pressed it, and the garage door began its slow ascent. Too slow. Before it was halfway up, a figure appeared in the doorway connecting the garage to the kitchen. In the dim light, Emma recognized Calvin Reynolds, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled, a pistol in his hand. Stop right there, Miss Barrett, he said, his voice eerily calm. This has gone far enough. Emma gunned the engine, ducking low as the Buick surged forward. The garage door wasn't fully open, but there was enough clearance for the car's hood. Metal scraped against metal as the Buick burst through, tearing the garage door partially from its track. A sharp crack, gunshot, and the rear window shattered, sending glass shards spraying across the back seat. Emma swerved onto the driveway and then the main road, accelerating hard. In the rearview mirror, she saw Calvin emerging from the garage, raising his pistol for another shot. Before he could fire, flashing lights appeared on the horizon, police cruisers responding to Ellie's 911 call. Calvin lowered the gun and retreated toward his vehicle. Emma kept driving, putting as much distance as possible between herself and her pursuers. The evidence bag sat on the passenger seat, its contents intact despite the chaos. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed as multiple law enforcement vehicles converged on the area. Emma had no way of knowing if Thomas and Frank were safe, if Grace had been seriously hurt, or if Ellie had faced repercussions for helping her escape. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, to protect the evidence that Daniel Reynolds had died for, evidence that might finally bring his killers to justice. The restoration of the Ford F-100 had led to this moment of truth. Like any restoration, it had revealed both damage and resilience, layers of corruption and decay, but also the solid foundation of justice that had endured beneath it all. Now it was up to Emma to ensure that foundation would support the weight of truth, no matter how heavy it might be. The federal building in Louisville stood tall against the morning sky, its windows reflecting the sunrise in shades of amber and gold. Emma clutched the waterproof evidence bag against her chest, exhaustion and adrenaline warring within her as she approached the security checkpoint. Her clothes were dirty from the night's ordeal, leaves and twigs still caught in her hair, hardly the appearance of someone with legitimate business in a government building. I need to see Jennifer Lawson, she told the security officer, her voice steadier than she felt. Department of Justice, it's urgent. The officer's skeptical gaze swept over her disheveled appearance. Do you have an appointment? No, but she's expecting evidence regarding Atlas Security Solutions and weapons trafficking in Iraq. Emma leaned closer, lowering her voice. Grace Wilson sent me. There are people trying to kill for what I'm carrying. Something in her intensity must have registered. The officer made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones while keeping a wary eye on Emma. After what seemed an eternity, he nodded. Someone's coming down to escort you. 5 minutes later, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense pantsuit emerged from the elevator. She took in Emma's appearance with a quick, assessing glance. I'm Jennifer Lawson, she said, and Grace called me last night. Said you might be coming. Where is she? The simple question threatened to unravel Emma's composure. I don't know. They caught her while we were escaping. Thomas Reynolds and Frank Mason were at the farmhouse when it was attacked. I don't know if any of them. Her voice faltered. Lawson's expression softened marginally. Let's talk upstairs. You look like you could use coffee and a safe place to sit down. In Lawson's office, Emma surrendered the evidence bag and gave a detailed account of everything that had transpired since she first agreed to restore Thomas's truck. Jennifer Lawson listened intently, taking notes but rarely interrupting. When Emma described the previous night's events, the DOJ attorney's face darkened. This is extremely serious, she said when Emma had finished. Armed men attacking a private residence, shots fired, assault, and possible kidnapping. And the weapons trafficking allegations alone would warrant a major federal investigation. What about Thomas and Frank and Grace? Emma asked, the question that had been burning inside her since her escape. Lawson picked up her phone. I'm going to find out right now. While Lawson made calls, Emma slumped in her chair, the full weight of exhaustion finally claiming her. She hadn't slept in over 24 hours. Every muscle ached from the dash through the woods, and the enormity of what had happened, what was still happening, pressed upon her consciousness like a physical weight. The office window offered a view of downtown Louisville, a city Emma had rarely visited despite growing up in Kentucky. People moved along the streets below, going about their ordinary lives, unaware of the life and death drama unfolding above them. How strange that the world continued its routine while her entire reality had been upended. She thought of Thomas Reynolds, standing resolute with a shotgun as men invaded his home. Of Frank Mason, his hand steady on a pistol as he prepared to defend his friend. Of Grace Wilson, deliberately drawing their pursuers away to give Emma a chance to escape. These people had been strangers to her just weeks ago. Now she feared for their lives with an intensity that surprised her. And beneath it all lay Daniel Reynolds, a man she'd never met but whose quest for truth had set everything in motion. His courage, his meticulous planning, his determination to expose corruption even at the risk of his own life, these qualities had shaped events 20 years after his death. In a very real sense, Daniel had reached out from beyond the grave to assemble this unlikely team. His grieving father, his father's war buddy, a veteran's advocate, and a mechanic with skilled hands and a stubborn heart. Kentucky State Police responded to reports of gunfire at the Reynolds property around midnight, Lawson reported, returning to her desk. They found evidence of a confrontation, broken windows, shotgun shells, but no victims or suspects. Local hospitals have no record of admitting anyone matching our people's descriptions. That could be good or bad, Emma said quietly. I've put out priority alerts to all law enforcement in Kentucky and neighboring states. If they're in custody anywhere, we'll know soon. Lawson's tone was professional but not unkind. In the meantime, I need to get you to a secure location. If Calvin Reynolds and his associates are willing to stage an armed assault, they won't hesitate to come after you. I can't just hide while the others might be in danger, Emma protested. The best thing you can do for them right now is stay safe and cooperate with our investigation. Their sacrifice won't mean anything if we can't build a case. Lawson held Emma's gaze. I promise you, finding them is a top priority. 2 federal marshals escorted Emma to a hotel where she was checked in under an assumed name. A female agent provided clean clothes and basic toiletries, while another stood guard outside her room. The hotel was upscale, far more luxurious than anywhere Emma had ever stayed, but its comfort felt hollow under the circumstances. She showered, washing away the dirt and sweat of her ordeal, watching leaves and twigs from the woods swirl down the drain. The hot water eased her aching muscles, but did nothing for the knot of worry in her chest. As she dried off, she caught sight of her reflection in the bathroom mirror. A stranger's face, pale and drawn, with shadows beneath her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully, interrupted by nightmares of gunshots and Calvin Reynolds' eerily calm voice. In her dreams, she ran through endless woods, pursued by faceless men, while Thomas, Frank, and Grace called for help from places she couldn't reach. She woke to knocking and Lawson's voice. The digital clock read 4:17 p.m. She'd been asleep for nearly 7 hours. We found Frank Mason, Lawson announced when Emma opened the door. He's in the hospital in Lexington. Gunshot wound to the shoulder, but he's stable. Relief flooded through Emma, followed immediately by renewed concern. And Thomas? Grace? Still looking, but Frank's conscious and asking for you. I thought you might want to see him. The drive to Lexington took just over an hour, during which Lawson brought Emma up to speed on the investigation's progress. Federal agents had executed search warrants at Calvin Reynolds' home and office. Preliminary examination of Daniel's evidence had already yielded significant leads, with several Atlas security executives being brought in for questioning. The microfilm was particularly damning, Lawson explained. Those photographs placed Calvin Reynolds at weapons transfers to known insurgent groups, a clear violation of the Anti-Terrorism Act, not to mention arms trafficking laws. What about the people higher up? Emma asked. Daniel's notes mentioned military officers, government officials. We're working up the chain. Cases like this are delicate. The higher ranking the target, the more carefully we need to build our case. Lawson's expression was determined. But make no mistake, we're going all the way to the top with this one. As they drove past rolling Kentucky hills and horse farms, Emma considered the scope of what Daniel had uncovered. Not just corrupt contractors, but a system that allowed, perhaps even encouraged, the exploitation of war for profit. How many lives had been lost to the weapons Atlas had funneled to both sides of the conflict? How many soldiers, including Daniel himself, had died because they'd stumbled onto uncomfortable truths? Your friend Frank is quite resilient, Lawson remarked as they approached Lexington. State police found him 2 miles from the Reynolds farm, having walked there with a bullet in his shoulder. He refused treatment until he'd given a full statement about the attack. That sounds like Frank, Emma said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like days. Lexington's University Hospital was a sprawling complex of modern buildings. 2 more marshals met them at the entrance, evidence that the Department of Justice was taking the threat seriously. They escorted Emma and Lawson to a private room where Frank Mason lay propped up in bed, his left shoulder heavily bandaged, an IV line running into his right arm. Knew you'd make it, he said when he saw Emma, his voice weaker than usual but his eyes alert. Emma rushed to his bedside, relief washing over her. What happened? Where are Thomas and Grace? Frank grimaced as he shifted position. Thomas and I held them off as long as we could. Must have been 8 or 9 of them. Professional types, military training. When they breached the house, Thomas told me to run for the back door while he covered me. His voice faltered. Took a round in the shoulder on my way out. Last I saw, Thomas was still fighting. And Grace? Don't know. Haven't heard anything. Frank's weathered face showed his concern. But Grace Wilson is tougher than she looks. Vietnam didn't break her, and she's been through worse since. Vietnam? Emma asked, confused. Grace was in Vietnam? Frank's eyebrows rose. She never told you? Grace was an Army nurse, 3 tours. That's where she met her husband. Captain Wilson, 173rd Airborne. Same unit as Thomas and me. This revelation added another layer to Emma's understanding of Grace. Her surprising woodland skills, her calm under pressure, her deep connection to veterans' causes. It wasn't just advocacy, it was personal experience. Lawson, who had been standing near the door, stepped forward. Mr. Mason, we need to discuss protection arrangements. Given your testimony and the evidence we've secured, you're a key witness in what's shaping up to be a major federal case. I'm not hiding until we find Thomas, Frank said firmly. Nobody's asking you to hide, Lawson replied, but we need to ensure your safety. The same people who came after you last night will try again. Their discussion was interrupted by a nurse entering with a medication. As she adjusted Frank's IV, a news report on the room's television caught Emma's attention. Prominent Louisville attorney Calvin Reynolds was found dead in his vehicle this morning, the apparent victim of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Reynolds, whose law firm represents several major defense contractors, was under investigation for alleged connections to illegal weapons trafficking, according to sources close to the investigation. In related news, federal agents have raided the offices of Atlas Security Solutions, a private military contractor with extensive operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The news hit Emma like a physical blow. Calvin Reynolds, dead by his own hand. It seemed both justice and evasion at once, his suicide denying them the satisfaction of seeing him answer for his crimes while simultaneously confirming his guilt. He chose the coward's way out, Frank observed grimly. Wonder if it really was suicide. Emma murmured, thinking of Daniel's death that had been staged to look self-inflicted. Either way, he's beyond earthly justice now, Frank said, but his partners aren't, and they're the ones who will be scrambling. Lawson was already on her phone, stepping into the hallway for privacy. When she returned, her expression was guarded. Calvin's death complicates things, she said. His associates will be scrambling to distance themselves, destroy evidence, cut deals. We need to move quickly. What about Thomas and Grace? Emma insisted. Calvin's death might actually help us there. His associates will be focused on saving themselves now, not pursuing loose ends. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Raised voices, hurried footsteps. Then the door burst open to reveal a hospital orderly supporting an elderly man whose clothes were filthy and torn. Thomas, Emma cried, recognizing the stooped figure despite his disheveled state. Thomas Reynolds looked as though he'd aged a decade overnight. His face was bruised, a cut above his left eye crudely bandaged. He leaned heavily on his cane, which appeared to have been broken and hastily repaired with duct tape. "Thought I'd find you two here," he said, his voice raspy but triumphant. "Figured Frank was too ornery to die." The reunited allies shared a moment of profound relief as Thomas was helped to a chair. A doctor was summoned to examine him despite his protests that he was just tired, not injured. "How did you escape?" Emma asked when the initial commotion had settled. Thomas's weathered face broke into a grim smile. "Old hunting tunnels under the barn. My grandfather dug them during Prohibition for moving moonshine. Those boys weren't expecting a man my age to squeeze through a hole that size." His expression sobered. "But Grace, have you heard anything about Grace?" The weight of Grace's unknown fate settled over the room. Lawson promised to intensify the search, dispatching agents to check hospitals and clinics within a 100-mile radius. While Thomas was being examined, Emma and Frank conferred with Lawson about next steps. The DOJ attorney explained that with Calvin dead and Atlas Security under federal investigation, the immediate danger had likely passed, but they would remain under protection until all Atlas operatives were accounted for. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "To the case, I mean." "We build on Daniel's evidence," Lawson replied. "Frank and Thomas's testimonies, your account of Calvin's confession and assault, the documentary evidence from the safety deposit box and truck compartments. It's more than enough to pursue indictments against Atlas executives and the government officials who protected them." "And Daniel?" Thomas asked, returning from his examination with a proper bandage replacing his makeshift one. "Will his name be cleared?" "The official cause of death will be changed from suicide to homicide," Lawson confirmed, "and his service to his country, exposing this corruption, will be formally recognized." Thomas nodded, a mixture of grief and vindication in his eyes. 20 years late, but he deserves that much. That evening, as Thomas rested in a hospital room of his own and federal agents stood guard in the corridors, Emma sat with Frank, talking quietly about the events that had brought them to this point. "Did you suspect?" she asked. "About Calvin, I mean, before Daniel died." Frank considered the question, absently rubbing his injured shoulder. "Not Calvin specifically, but Daniel told me he didn't know who to trust. Said the corruption went high up, into places that should have been beyond reproach." He sighed heavily. "I should have pushed harder, done more to protect him." "You couldn't have known they'd killed him." "Couldn't I?" Frank's voice was bitter. "We'd both seen what happens in war zones when money and power are at stake. People disappear. Accidents happen. I just never thought it would follow us home." Emma remembered the microfilm images. Calvin Reynolds directing weapons transfers in the Iraqi desert, meeting with insurgent leaders, signing documents that authorized the diversion of military supplies to the black market. How does someone like Calvin become that corrupt, she wondered aloud. He's Thomas's nephew. He grew up with Daniel. Slowly then all at once, Frank replied. That's how it usually happens. A small compromise here, a blind eye there. Then one day you're in so deep that turning back seems impossible. He met her gaze steadily. That's why what Daniel did was so brave. He saw the path he was on and chose to turn back, no matter the cost. 2 days passed with no word of Grace Wilson. Emma, Thomas, and Frank remained under federal protection, providing formal statements and identifying Atlas operatives from photographs. The investigation expanded rapidly, with arrests spanning multiple states and even reaching into the Pentagon and State Department. Emma stayed at Thomas's side when she could, helping him navigate the bewildering process of formal interviews and evidence reviews. His resilience amazed her. Despite his age and the trauma he'd endured, he remained clear-eyed and determined, his testimony precise and damning. "You remind me of Daniel," he told her during a quiet moment between interviews. "Not just smart, but stubborn about the truth. Won't let go once you've got hold of something." "Is that a compliment or a criticism?" Emma asked with a small smile. "Both, probably." Thomas's eyes crinkled at the corners. "It's what got him killed, but it's also what's bringing him justice now. Some truths are worth being stubborn about." On the third morning, as they gathered in a secure conference room to review progress with Lawson, a commotion erupted in the hallway. The door opened to reveal a marshal supporting a small figure with auburn hair streaked with gray. "Grace!" Thomas exclaimed, rising so quickly he nearly toppled his chair. Grace Wilson looked exhausted and moved with obvious pain, but her eyes were clear and determined as ever. A bandage wrapped her left forearm, and bruises mottled her visible skin. "Sorry I'm late," she said with remarkable composure. "Had to take a detour through Indiana." The story emerged in pieces as Grace recovered her strength. When captured, she had been taken to a remote hunting cabin where Calvin Reynolds himself had interrogated her about the evidence. Her military background had served her well. She had revealed nothing despite threats and physical coercion. When news of Calvin's raids reached them, they panicked, Grace explained. "Left me tied up while they cleared out their equipment. Didn't count on an old lady knowing how to slip flex cuffs." Her matter-of-fact tone belied the courage her escape must have required. "How did you get back?" Frank asked, admiration evident in his voice. "Hitchhiked to the nearest town, then called an old army buddy who lives in Indianapolis. He drove me as far as Louisville, where I contacted Jennifer." Grace accepted a cup of water from a concerned agent. "The worst part was not knowing if any of you had made it out." With Grace's safe return, the final piece of their puzzle fell into place. The four unlikely allies, a mechanic, a grieving father, a Vietnam veteran, and a veterans advocate, had succeeded where official investigations had failed, exposing a conspiracy that had claimed Daniel Reynolds' life and countless others in the war-torn regions where Atlas had operated. In the weeks that followed, as autumn deepened toward winter, the federal case against Atlas Security and its conspirators dominated national headlines. High-ranking military officers, government officials, and corporate executives faced charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy to commit murder. The weapons trafficking operation was exposed in its full scope, a cynical scheme to profit from conflict by arming all sides while using American military resources as cover. Jennifer Lawson became the public face of the prosecution, her press conferences detailed and damning. Behind the scenes, Emma, Thomas, Frank, and Grace provided crucial testimony, filling in the gaps that Daniel's evidence couldn't cover alone. The impact extended beyond criminal charges. Congressional hearings were convened to examine oversight of private military contractors. Military procurement procedures were audited and reformed. The ripple effects touched policies on battlefield intelligence, whistleblower protections, and veterans' mental health services. For Emma, Thomas, Frank, and Grace, life gradually returned to something resembling normalcy, though none of them would ever be quite the same. The bonds forged in danger and shared purpose remained strong, creating a chosen family where once there had been only isolated individuals. Emma returned to Pinewood, where Joe Hayden welcomed her back to the garage with gruff affection and not a few questions about her sudden disappearance and equally sudden return. The national news had carried sanitized versions of the Atlas security scandal, but in a small town like Pinewood, rumors spread quickly. Emma found herself regarded with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and grudging respect by the locals. "Heard you helped bust open some big government conspiracy," Joe remarked casually one afternoon as they worked side by side on a temperamental Chevy engine. "That why the FBI boys keep dropping by to check on you?" Emma smiled noncommittally. Part of her protection arrangement with the Justice Department included regular check-ins by federal agents, ostensibly to ensure her safety, but also to monitor for any signs of retaliation from Atlas associates who remained at large. "Just doing what needed doing," she replied, a phrase she'd come to use often when questioned about her role in the scandal. Joe snorted. Well, whatever you did seems like it mattered. Don't think I've ever seen the Reynolds place with so many visitors. Old Thomas practically has a social life now. It was true, Thomas's farm, once a place of isolation and grief, had become a gathering spot for veterans who'd heard about his stand against corruption. They came to offer support, share stories, sometimes just to sit quietly on the porch with someone who understood what it meant to lose comrades to betrayal rather than honest combat. 3 months after the night of their escape, they gathered at the Reynolds farm on a crisp December morning. The reason for their reunion sat in the barn, gleaming in the winter sunlight. The 1955 Ford F-100 fully restored. Emma had completed the restoration during the investigation, working on it whenever she could escape the endless depositions and interviews. The truck had been transformed from a rusting relic to a magnificent machine, its blue paint lustrous, its chrome trim gleaming, its engine purring with renewed life. The restoration had become her sanctuary amid the legal storm, a place where problems had clear solutions, where damaged parts could be replaced, where the physics of internal combustion remained blessedly consistent despite the chaos of human affairs. She's beautiful, Thomas said, running a reverent hand along the fender. Daniel would have loved to see her like this. He does see it, Grace said softly. I believe that. Frank nodded, his arms still in a sling, but healing well. The boy had vision, knew this old girl had life in her yet. Emma handed the keys to Thomas. She's ready whenever you are. Thomas took the keys, their weight familiar in his palm. 20 years ago, this truck had represented only loss and grief to him. Now it stood as a symbol of something else, of truth revealed, of justice served, of a promise kept across decades and beyond death. The four of them climbed into the cab, Thomas behind the wheel, Emma beside him, Frank and Grace squeezing into the remaining space. The bench seat was crowded, but none of them minded the proximity. They had faced death together. A little discomfort was nothing in comparison. Thomas turned the key, and the engine responded immediately, a smooth, powerful rumble that spoke of expert restoration. He eased the truck out of the barn and down the driveway, heading toward the small cemetery where Martha Reynolds lay and where Daniel's remains would soon join her, now that the truth of his death had been acknowledged. The December air was crisp and clear, the Kentucky landscape stripped to its essential bones by winter. Bare trees stood like sentinels against the pale blue sky, fields lay fallow beneath a light dusting of frost, and the road unwound before them like a promise of journeys yet to come. Remember when you first came out here? Thomas asked Emma as they drove. Thought you were just another mechanic Grace had sent to humor an old man. Emma smiled, recalling her initial wariness, her focus on the pond rather than the man behind it. And I thought you were just a grumpy old veteran with a junk truck and too many memories. Wasn't wrong about the memories, Thomas said, a hint of his dry humor returning. Or the grumpy part, come to think of it. You had good reason, Grace observed from the back seat. 20 years carrying a burden no one should have to bear. Frank's voice rumbled from beside her. Not alone anymore, though. That's something. The truck handled beautifully, just as it had in its prime. Emma felt a surge of professional pride in the restoration, but more than that, a deeper satisfaction in having helped restore something far more precious than a vehicle. Truth, justice, and the connections between four people who might otherwise have remained alone in their separate lives. They reached the cemetery, a peaceful plot of land adjacent to Pinewood's small Baptist church. Thomas parked the truck, and they walked together to Martha's grave, where preparations were being made for Daniel's reinterment. The military had agreed to a formal ceremony with honors, a gesture that meant more to Thomas than any official acknowledgement or apology. His son, once considered a suicide statistic, would be recognized as what he truly was, a casualty of his own integrity, a soldier who had continued to serve his country even after leaving the battlefield. As they stood by Martha's headstone, Thomas spoke quietly. Daniel used to come here every Sunday after church, would sit and talk to his mother about his week, his plans. Said she always gave the best advice, even when she couldn't answer back. Emma thought of her own conversations with her grandfather's headstone, the comfort she'd found in maintaining that connection even after death. Some bonds transcended the physical world, persisting in memory and love. "What will you do now?" Grace asked Emma as they walked back to the truck. "With the investigation winding down, I mean." Emma hadn't fully decided, but the answer came naturally. "Joe Hayden's retiring next month. He's offered to sell me the garage at a price I can actually manage." She smiled. "I think I'll stay in Pinewood. There are plenty of old machines that deserve a second chance. And people too," Frank added with uncharacteristic sentimentality. "What about you three?" Emma asked. Grace and Frank exchanged glances. "The Veterans Advocacy Committee has asked me to head up a new whistleblower protection initiative," Grace said, "using Daniel's case as a framework for policy reform. And I've been asked to consult," Frank added. "Turns out my paranoid suspicion of authority, as my ex-wife called it, is considered an asset in government oversight circles." Thomas's plans were simpler, but no less meaningful. Going to fix up the farmhouse. Been neglecting it too long. Maybe turn part of it into a gathering place for vets who need somewhere quiet to talk, or not talk, depending. As they climbed back into the truck, Emma realized how much had changed since she first arrived at the Reynolds farm. She had come seeking work, a paycheck, perhaps professional satisfaction in a challenging restoration. Instead, she had found a mission, a purpose, and people who had become as important to her as family. Thomas pulled the truck into the cemetery's small parking area. Before they got out, he turned to Emma, his weathered face solemn but peaceful. "My father used to say that a good truck is like a good life, built to last, meant to work, valuable not for how it looks, but for what it carries." He patted the dashboard affectionately. "This old girl carried my father's dreams, my memories, Daniel's evidence, and now she carries justice. And friendship," Grace added quietly. "Don't forget that." They walked together to Martha's grave, where a second headstone now stood beside hers. "Daniel Reynolds," the inscription read, followed by his dates of birth and in death, his military rank, and a simple epitaph. "He spoke truth to power." Thomas placed a hand on his son's headstone, his expression a complex mixture of grief and pride. "We finished the restoration, son, just like we planned." As they stood in respectful silence, a weak winter sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the scene in pale gold light. The F-100 gleamed in the distance, restored and renewed, just as the truth of Daniel's life and death had been restored after decades of darkness. Thomas's farm became an unofficial retreat for veterans struggling with the aftermath of service. The barn was converted into a workshop where former soldiers could work with their hands, finding healing in tangible creation as Thomas himself had done. Frank helped when his consulting work allowed, teaching younger veterans the mechanical skills he'd learned through necessity in Vietnam. Grace divided her time between Washington, where her veterans advocacy work took on new urgency in the wake of the Atlas scandal, and Pinewood, where she had found a community that understood service and sacrifice without requiring explanation. The blue Ford F-100 became a familiar sight around Pinewood, its distinctive engine note announcing Thomas's arrival before he could be seen. Sometimes Emma rode with him, the two of them discussing mechanical minutiae or sitting in companionable silence. Sometimes Frank or Grace accompanied him on errands or visits to the cemetery. But most meaningful were the times when all four traveled together, the cab crowded but comfortable, a mobile emblem of their unlikely alliance. 1 year after Daniel's reinterment, they gathered at the cemetery for a private memorial. The federal cases against Atlas Security and its government enablers had concluded with multiple convictions and sweeping reforms. Daniel's service had been officially recognized with a posthumous commendation. Justice, as much as the system could provide, had been served. Yet for Thomas, the most profound vindication came not from courts or commendations, but from the knowledge that his son's courage had not been in vain. Daniel's evidence had exposed corruption, saved lives, and changed policies. His legacy lived on in reforms that would protect future whistleblowers and hold powerful interests accountable. As they stood before the twin headstones, Thomas spoke words he had carried in his heart for 20 years. "I'm proud of you, son. Always was, always will be." Some restorations take time, years, even decades. But in the end, quality craftsmanship endures, whether in vehicles or in human character. The truck that had once been a symbol of loss now stood as a testament to perseverance, to the enduring power of truth, and to the unexpected connections that can form when people unite around a common purpose. Emma Barrett had come to Pinewood as a mechanic looking for work. She would remain as something more, a keeper of stories, a restorer of what time and malice had broken, and a living link in a chain of justice that had begun with a young soldier's courage and ended with the vindication of his sacrifice. As they walked back to the truck, Emma felt a sense of completion unlike anything that she'd experienced before. The F-100's restoration was finished, but the restoration of their lives, Thomas's, Frank's, Grace's, and her own, was just beginning. They climbed back into the cab, and Thomas turned the key once more. The engine's steady rumble filled the air, a sound of reliability, of promises kept, of journeys still to come. "Where to now?" Thomas asked, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. Emma smiled. "Wherever the road takes us." The blue Ford F-100 pulled away from the cemetery, carrying its passengers toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Like the truck itself, they had been tested, broken, and carefully restored, emerging stronger and more purposeful than before. Some things are built to last, whether vehicles or values. Truth, justice, courage, connection. And sometimes it takes a skilled mechanic to recognize what's worth saving, what can be restored, and what will carry us forward when the road ahead seems dark. The truck disappeared around a bend in the road, its engine note fading to a distant purr. But the story it carried of a father, a son, a mechanic, and the truth they had restored together would endure long after the sound had faded into silence.